Hey, welcome back everybody. Section 5, Texturing Models. So, basically to start off, why do we bake? Well, we definitely like to eat cookies and cakes. No. Basically, baking is another way to explain or define taking one object and baking a piece of it off so that you can use it in other software, other programs, in a game engine, for example, or in a rendering or other animation programs. And basically, to give you a quick overview of what a normal map is and an ambient occlusion map, so that you get an idea of what we're going to be doing here, I've got a couple examples for you. So the first example on the left is going to be of a normal map. So these images are from Wikipedia. On the left side, you have the original mesh, and it says that that has about 4 million triangles within that mesh. So they definitely subdivided that several times to get that detail in there and the sculpting detail. And then in the middle, you have the simplified mesh where they went over and I think that mesh is a little too simplified almost. I'd almost say that you'd want to shrink wrap that maybe a little bit more or kind of get in the grooves and stuff. But 500 triangles, definitely doable by a game engine or shorten your rendering time when you're animating. And so they have the simplified mesh, and then on the right picture you have the simplified mesh with a normal map added on top of it. So you can see how it baked all of that normal map details, the height and the little details that are on that left picture was baked out of that and put on to the simplified mesh to create what's on the right. So it's 500 triangles, but it looks like the 4 million triangle picture on the left. And that is what video games do. Not exclusively, they also do that to decrease rendering time when they're animating movies nowadays and things. You don't need to be having items that are 4 million triangles when you can have them look the same and only be 500 triangles and decrease your render time, and also it looks good. And video games can handle 500 triangles a lot easier than they can 4 million. On the picture on the right, where it has the disregard the German descriptions there, unless you are from Germany, then you can definitely read what it's saying here. Pretty much on the top, you have a normal render that doesn't have any ambient occlusion, which I like to call shadows. The middle has the ambient occlusion, so you can see the shadows that are baked of these blocks. And then on the bottom, you have the render without the ambient occlusion put together with the ambient occlusion. And you can see that the bottom picture looks very much more realistic. You can see shadows that define the cubes a lot better. And that's what an ambient occlusion map is, basically the shadows and how the light reacts with the object. So we are going to work on creating these two maps today for our sword. And so let's hop into Blender and get started. Alright, so here we are where we left off before. We have the UV map screen here, our node screen, and we're going to be using these screens to bake our maps also. So let's go ahead and prep our items. What we need to do is we need to have the low polygon sword and the high polygon sword directly on top of each other in the same space. And let's go ahead and unlock our view screen so that we're not locked just onto the one sword. You can press A to deselect all this, and you can see our seam still there. And let's go ahead and get this. Let's see, I think we put it over here in this. Yeah, we did. This is our high poly sword over in this layer. Let's go ahead and press M to move, and move it to our first layer so that it's with our low polygon sword. And they're pretty much already right on top of each other because we had them that way from before we started day 4, video 3. And basically, to ensure that they're on top of each other, I'm going to go ahead and select the high poly, hold shift, also select the low poly. Now they're both selected, and I'm going to go ahead and click Alt G or Option G on the Mac, Alt G on the Windows, and it's going to bring them both down to kind of the ground level. Now they're kind of in the middle of that plane, but they were brought to the same exact place, so we know that they're pretty much directly on top of each other as best as they can be. And now we are ready to get started. So let's go ahead and go to our low poly, click the low poly sword, put it in solid mode also. We don't need to be in texture mode. Make sure our high poly is in object mode, our low poly is in object mode. And the big thing that we need to do here is we need to make sure that we select the high poly first, hold shift, and then select the low poly. The last item in the outline there that you select is going to be the selected item, what is referenced as the selected item. And so we want our low poly sword to be that selected item. And I'll show you why in a minute. So if you already have the test image here, just go ahead and click the X. That'll be down here to get that out of your screen. We're also going to delete or just X off of our test material to get these screens blank. Because right now we are going to create a new image, just like we did with the test image. It's just this one's going to be a blank new image to bake our normal map on top of. So we're going to hit new. It's already at the 4K, which is fine. Let's entitle it normal. And let's change UV grid, which is what we use for the test image, to blank. And hit OK. And now we have this nice black square, which is what we want. And so this is blank. And now we need to come up here. Our low poly sword is still the selected item. Let's create a new material. It's going to put our default diffuse shader in there. And let's name this material. We can keep it this way. So now that we created a new material, put our default diffuse shader there. Let's go ahead and do Shift A to add a image texture right here, just like we did with the test texture. It's just this one we are going to select, browse, and select our normal item here, our normal image that we created down below. So now in the properties panel over here, or the properties panel, you're going to want to come over to the render, the little picture of a camera. Click that, scroll all the way down, and you can see bake down here. We'll open that up. And in this baking properties panel, it says the default is combined. We don't want that. We want to select normal. And we can have it to where every time it runs, it clears what's already on this map. So if we want to redo it, you just have that checked and it'll delete what's on there and then put the new bake on there. And we also want the selected to active selected. So it's going to bake onto the actively selected object. So we're baking the details of the high poly sword onto the low poly sword. And so that's why we want our low poly sword actively selected here. But we also need to make sure our high poly sword is selected also, which it's not right now. So we'll left click high poly, hold shift, and then left click the low poly sword again to make sure those are both selected, and our low poly sword is the active selection. And the ray distance we may change. We'll see how this first bake goes. It basically says the distance that it's going to shoot a ray out of to get the detail. And we probably should just increase this to, I'd say, let's try 0.1. It doesn't need to be very far. That might even be too, like 0.05 might be a better start. Because 0, I don't know even why that's the default, because if it's 0, then the ray is not going to go anywhere. But it usually does pick up the minimal detail, even at 0. So we could have tried it with that, but 0.05 should get us the distance we need for this sword, because they're really not that much higher than the other mesh. So here we go. Let's go ahead and start this bake. You can see it's starting to texture bake up here, and it's creating its bake right down there. It's going to take a little bit of time, not too long, just because it's not a huge item. And there we go. So we can see our normal map, and if you've never seen one before, this is sort of good. Everywhere that it's blue is what we want to see. We want to see this light blue kind of outline of the detail. The green, it's probably hitting, what's probably happening with the green is that since we have the ray casting out at 0.05, it's probably going in one side of the handle and hitting the back side of the handle. So let's go ahead and try to rebake this. Let's put this down to 0.02. Let's try 0.01 and see what we get with that. Make sure clear is selected so it'll clear what this is and rebake. And let's go ahead and do this. Bake again and wait the time limit here. Shouldn't take very long again. And our ray's at 0.01. We'll see how it looks. It didn't even... That's a little worse, I guess. So maybe we had to go the other way. And then this is can get a little finicky, but you just kind of play with it, keep baking, change your ray distance, try to get it to where everything's a blue or a light blue color. And that's going to be your preferred normal map or the actual normal map. That's a lot better, 0.1. It looks like we might be having some issues on the hilt. It's just not far enough for the hilt ornament to get that far up. So let's just try 0.15. Probably going to go ahead and stop the video and mess around with this until I get that perfect setting, and then I'll show you what that perfect setting is for our sword. So after playing around a little bit, I figured that the ray distance 0.8 gave me the best result that I wanted. What's going on here, I'm thinking, with this little artifact here and at the top of the blade, is that we have a little bit more mesh of the blade kind of intersecting here, and that's not even going to be seen. So basically this part will be seen, which is right here, and that very nicely. So let's go ahead and keep this the way it is here at 0.8, and go ahead and bake your normal map for the sword. And I want to point out after this is baked that there's an asterisk right here next to the word image, and that's telling you that this is not saved. So even if I were to come up here and do file save on my Blender file, it's not gonna save this image. This image needs to be saved separately, and that's done right here. So I'm going to do a save as image, and I'm going to go ahead and put it in day 5 video 1. Let's put it right there, just save as image. And now it's saved and then asterisk has gone away. So you want to make sure whenever you're creating an image or baking anything that you save it separately here so that you actually keep it. And now we will move on to baking our ambient occlusion map. So it's pretty much the same process. We're going to need to create a new texture image. So let's go ahead and X out of this, do new. We'll call this AO for ambient occlusion. We have it at 4K, which is fine. We can keep it blank, say OK. And now we just kind of rinse and repeat. Let's go ahead and take off our, well, we can actually keep the same material. We just have to select the AO because we want it to bake onto this image texture and not the normal one that we just created. And obviously we'll come down here to the bake properties and we'll change this from normal to ambient occlusion. And let's go ahead and keep selected to active. We make sure our two items are selected. They're right on top of each other. We'll go ahead and bake. And the ray distance is at 8. We can probably leave it as that. The ambient occlusion isn't finicky one like the normal map, because the normal map, it's trying to get the height just right of that detail that you created in your sculpt. And the ambient occlusion is just basically going to help for that lighting effect. You know, what parts need to have lighting shined on it to make it look more realistic. So there we go, our ambient occlusion map is now baked. You can see it right here. And you can see that there's not much to see with just our sword, just because it's kind of a smaller object, but you can definitely see where it's going to be a little darker in that groove in the middle. Also around the ornament at the top of the hilt is a little darker because it's obviously shadow up there. It's a little bit more shadow on the back of these little ornaments right here, and it's looking good. So that is how we bake our normal and ambient occlusion maps, and then the only other map you really need to have your basics is a color map, a full color map. And if you were to combine all three of those into another program like Unity, for example, as a game engine, then the sword in this case would look just like we've built it here in Blender, and it would be workable inside the Unity game engine as a low poly object. So awesome.